Welcome to Strange But True. Take a breath, slow down, and listen carefully. Some stories are documented, some are debated, some refuse to be explained. We tell you the stories. You decide what's true. Now, let's begin our journey. Most people assume that systems exist to make life easier. They believe procedures were created to reduce confusion. They believe forms were introduced to speed things up. They believe checklists were designed to prevent mistakes. And in many cases, that was once true. But over time, something quietly changed. Processes that were created to support human judgment began replacing it. Rules that were meant to guide decisions began making them. And procedures that were designed to help people think began thinking for them. Today, it is normal to hear phrases like, "That's just the process." "That's not how the system works. There's nothing we can do." These statements are treated as explanations, but they are not explanations. They are endpoints. They signal the moment when a human decision has been surrendered to a procedure. Someone applies for assistance they clearly qualify for. They submit every required document. They meet every stated condition, and still they receive a rejection letter. Not because they were ineligible, but because a single box on a form was filled incorrectly. There is no appeal process. There is no human reviewer. There's only the instruction to submit the form again and wait. In earlier societies, most decisions were made locally. Disputes were resolved through conversation. Exceptions were handled through judgment. Problems were addressed by people who could see them directly. A mistake could be corrected immediately. A rule could be bent if it caused harm. A decision could be reversed if it didn't make sense. There was no universal script for how things had to be done. There was only context. There was only discretion. There was only human reasoning. That began to change as organizations grew larger, as institutions expanded, as populations increased, as systems became more complex. Leaders began searching for ways to make decisions consistent. They wanted predictability. They wanted uniformity. They wanted reliability. So they began writing procedures. At first, these procedures were simple. They described best practices. They documented lessons learned. They offered guidance for common situations. They were not mandatory. They were not rigid. They were not absolute. They existed to support judgment, not to replace it. But over time, the role of procedures quietly shifted. Guidelines became requirements. Recommendations became rules. Flexibility became deviation. What had once been optional became compulsory. What had once been advisory became enforceable. One of the clearest examples of this shift appears in the history of bureaucratic paperwork. For most of human history, administration was minimal. Records were kept locally. Decisions were made face-to-face. Authority was exercised by people who knew the situation. But as governments grew larger in the 19th century, they began building centralized record systems. In the United States, the Census Bureau was formalized in 1902. In Britain, civil registration systems expanded rapidly after 1837. These offices were not built to deny services. They were built to organize growing populations. But once forms became the official record, the form itself began deciding outcomes. Forms were introduced to standardize how information was collected, not to restrict people, not to trap them in red tape, but to manage scale. At first, forms were flexible tools. If someone made a mistake, it could be corrected. If information was missing, it could be clarified. If a case didn't fit neatly into a category, an exception could be made. But as record volumes increased, manual judgment became harder to maintain. Clerks were overwhelmed, offices were understaffed, files piled up, so new rules were introduced. Forms had to be completed exactly. Boxes had to be checked properly. Fields could not be left blank. Processing became procedural, not because people wanted it that way, but because it was the only way to keep up. Over time, something subtle happened. The form stopped being a tool. It became the decision itself. If a box was not checked, the answer was no. If a field was incomplete, the request was denied. If a document was missing, the case could not proceed. The outcome no longer depended on what made sense. It depended on what the process allowed. A person could clearly qualify for assistance and still be rejected. A request could be reasonable and still be denied. A problem could be obvious and still be ignored. Because the system did not permit a different result. The procedure had replaced judgment. This same pattern appears in the history of early computing. When computers were first introduced into administrative systems in the mid-20th century, they were meant to speed up paperwork. They were meant to reduce human error. They were meant to process large data sets. They were meant to support decision-making. At first, human operators still made final decisions. They reviewed outputs. They interpreted results. They overrode mistakes. The computer was just a tool. But as software systems became more complex, and as organizations became more dependent on them, human discretion quietly faded. Rules were embedded into code. Decision logic was automated. Eligibility requirements were hard-coded. Thresholds were fixed. Exceptions were eliminated. For the first time in history, a decision could be made with no human involvement at all. A person could be denied housing, denied health care, denied travel, denied financial access, without any individual ever consciously choosing that outcome. The decision would exist only as a line of code executed by a machine. If the computer said no, there was often no way to appeal, not because anyone had decided appeals should be impossible, but because no one had built a process to handle them. The system was not designed to understand context. It was designed to follow rules, and over time, people stopped questioning that. The phrase computer error became an explanation, not a problem. If a person was denied benefits because of a database mismatch, the answer was not to investigate the case. The answer was to tell them to fix their paperwork. If a traveler was flagged incorrectly, the answer was not to assess the situation. The answer was to repeat the screening process. If a medical record contained an error, the answer was not to override it. The answer was to submit a correction form and wait. The system had become the authority, not because it was more accurate, but because it was more consistent. And consistency was valued more than correctness. This shift was not driven by malice. It was driven by scale. As populations grew larger, as transactions increased, as systems became more interconnected, human judgment became harder to manage, so procedures were allowed to take its place. One decision at a time, one form at a time, one rule at a time. No one voted for this transformation. No law declared it. No single institution designed it. It emerged quietly through practical necessity. And once it was in place, it became almost impossible to reverse, because any attempt to reintroduce judgment looked like a risk. It looked like inconsistency. It looked like inefficiency. It looked like potential error. So the system stayed. even when it produced outcomes that made no sense, even when it harmed people, even when it contradicted reality. People were told that's just how the process works, which really meant that's how the system has replaced thinking. Just like passports, just like building codes, procedures were never meant to become permanent authorities, but they stayed. And over time, they stopped being tools. They became the system itself. The strange part is not that procedures exist. The strange part is how completely they have taken over. Most people today interact with processes more than they interact with decision makers. They fill out forms, they follow instructions, they click through workflows. They rarely speak to anyone who has the authority to change the outcome. The system decides, the human only submits. And over time, that feels normal. It feels safer. It feels more objective. It feels more legitimate, even when it produces absurd results, even when it denies obvious truths, even when it refuses to acknowledge exceptions, because challenging the system feels harder than accepting it, and so the process stays in place. Not because it works well, but because it works consistently. History has a way of hiding the truth inside what it chooses not to explain, inside tales, inside myths, inside legends, inside things that feel just a little off. If this story held your attention, subscribe to Strange But True, because sometimes what sounds unbelievable is exactly where the truth hides.